Yeah, I'm doing all right. I'm having another. I just seem to find exciting weeks wherever we go.
What a weekend we had.
We were at a Comic Con. Well, I say a Comic Con. It was actually a horror con that
Yep.
we were at. Everything was about horror, and people loved. I mean, they loved your work.
I,
It was,
I love the people who were there. The costumes were just incredible that were wandering around there. Did
yeah.
you see Gomez, Morticia on Wednesday?
Oh, the Adams. Yeah, they were
Yeah.
just brilliant, and I love the fact that it was that Wednesday was actually a toddler.
Yeah.
It was doing something as a family. I mean, seriously, horror does bring people together, usually in shallow graves, but it does bring people together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, there was a Rick and Morty wandering around there, which I thought looked brilliant. And the guy who was wearing the dog outfit, I was
Yeah.
thinking, what the hell is wrong with him? And then when you see that he's with Cruella de Vil, it was just
Yeah.
genius.
I spoke to them and it was so funny because it was one of those sort of things. His wife, that's the horror fan. And they weren't from there. They traveled quite a distance. They were actually from Derby.
Right.
And they were doing everything because they say we're based in Blackpool. This was based in Blackpool. So they travelled from Derby to go to that horror convention, and then they were going to do the Blackpool Dungeon, and then they were doing a Blackpool Ghost Walk. And he was like, and I don't want to do any of them. He was just because his wife wanted to do them, and I just thought that's why you're the Dalmatian, pal.
Yeah.
It was very very good. And you know what I love about conventions, and I'm going to sort of like we're going to talk about conventions in a minute. I love Comic Cons because when you go to them, the feeling, the atmosphere at them is so inclusive and so lovely, and everyone's there for the same reason. And you
Yeah.
get this really, really nice. You could spend all day. I mean, you saw my Stephen came down. He's 14.
Yeah.
He's not dressed up or anything. He sat at our table, and he was there all afternoon. He was there like 5 hours, 5.5 hours.
Yeah.
Never bored. You know, because you're just talking to nice people all the time. Now we tune that down to just a horror con. So everyone there were horror fans. And
Yeah.
I thought it got even nicer. Everybody really appreciated everybody's, joy of the genre.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And people were so accepting and forgiving. I mean, there were a couple of times I'd heard people scream
Mm.
because something had frightened them. And ordinarily, if I'm walking around a supermarket, and I'm not saying this to make myself sound like a great person, but if I'm walking around a supermarket and I hear a baby scream or something, my first thoughts are shut the fucking thing up, or yeah, where are the McCanns when you need babysitters, or something like that. But instead, I was sort of like there grinning alongside everybody else because this
Yeah.
was being frightened the way they wanted to be frightened.
Exactly. I mean, there was one, wasn't there? They had these professional cosplayers that were dressed up as zombies. And this one was just chasing this girl around. I mean, this girl must have been about 10, and her mother was wetting herself laughing. It was just so funny. But you could see, even though the girl was running away, scared and screaming, you could see how much she was actually enjoying it. She wasn't traumatized. She
Yeah.
wasn't, she was perfectly going to be able to sleep that night, you know. Yeah, and it did spark something. I mean, Saturday night, I have a confession to make, actually, Ash.
Go on.
And I know you're not going to think any less of me, but I have a confession to make. We watched Woman in Black 2, Angel of Death, on
All
Saturday
right.
night with our Stephen because he'd watched Woman in Black. He loved it. Or as I like to call it, Harry Potter and the Woman in Black. But so we watched the second one, and it's quite jumpy. Body count's a bit less, but he was jumping away. But I was a bit worried because it was the first scary movie we'd watched at night. Normally we watch them in an afternoon
Right.
so that he has the rest of the day. And he did find it a bit jumpy, but he did really, really well, actually, to stay in the room because he's not really good. He's not very good with horror films. But he stayed in the room and he loved it and he thought it was great. But I was a bit worried that he wouldn't sleep very well. So I needed to get the scares out of his head. So we sat down and we watched The Little Shop of Horrors.
Perfect. Yeah.
And you know my take on musicals, or the majority of musicals. There are some musicals that I do have a penchant for. And The Little Shop of Horrors just joined that list.
Isn't it brilliant?
Yeah, I mean, I used to watch it just for the puppetry, but I got into the backing singers and the way they just waltzed through the scenes, and original songs, so therefore it has more credence for me on that respect. But yeah, I've got to say, hand on heart, all right, I really, really love The Little Shop of Horrors.
I mean, Steve Martin steals that entire movie, and you think it can't get any better than Steve Martin. And then Bill Murray comes in as a patient, and you just think it got better.
Yeah.
How did it get better? But
yeah. It's the whole thing of it. And when it's because I like listening to lyrics. So I know we have arguments about Grease, and I always say that the entertainment of Grease is actually in the lyrics of the songs, because they are just mocking that whole bubblegum era of the late 50s in America on that rock and roll. And you hear it. I mean, particularly in some of the background songs, like Mooning, for example, you know, and there's another one about the woman who's going to the prom and it's raining on prom night. That was it. And the lyrics are hilarious all the way through it. And that's what I found with this. The lyrics were just so funny when you were really listening, when you really tuned into it. I'd put it there with the, like I say, it's now on there with Grease, as you know. I like the Rocky Horror Show. I like Avenue Q. That was one of the funniest things I've ever seen, and that now joins the list.
You need to watch Book of Mormon.
Yeah, that is one on my list that I do need to check out, actually. I have this whole thing of, I don't need to see Wicked. I'm pretty certain I don't need to see Wicked. I'm okay. I'm happy. Everybody likes it. It's original songs. It looks spectacular. Brilliant, but it's that kind of area of musicals I'm not so keen on. But this Avenue Q and Book of Mormon is definitely on that list that I need to see, because it borders on the, like I say, it's like Grease and the Rocky Horror Show and all of them. It borders on satire into absurdity rather than just being an add-on to another piece of. It's like the Back to the Future. Everyone who I know who's seen Back to the Future musical loves the Back to the Future musical, but it's not something that really appeals to me because it's not really my genre, the musical side of things. It needs to do something a bit more, which those other ones definitely do.
I think, although you're saying you wouldn't enjoy Wicked, I think you might get a kick out of it when you sort of like look at it and realise that it's Wizard of Oz, but told from the witch's perspective rather than Dorothy's perspective.
Yes.
I think you would enjoy that twist on it. I think you would enjoy that particular shape.
I think it's one of those ones. It's like with a lot of these things. I mean, I did have the wonderful experience of going to see the Scarlet Pimpernel off Broadway. And that the reason I say it was a wonderful experience, I had to go and see a musical when I was in New York. I needed to see an off-Broadway musical when I was in New York. And the musical was terrible. It was absolutely dreadful. But what was really fantastic were they always make this joke, don't they, that basically all gay people like musicals, or the gay fellas like musicals, right? But we were sat in the campest row you could ever possibly sit in. So we were sat with these American village, you could only describe them as queens, to be perfectly honest with you, that were absolutely squealing with delight at this absolutely overtly camp musical. And however much it detested my sense of what is a lovely piece of art, the joy that they were getting out of it made everything for me, because to me, I'm very much into reader response theory. And if I don't like it, it just means it's not for me. It doesn't mean it's actually rubbish. It just means it's not for me. And the joy that lot got out of it across, seriously, the row that we were sat on, I'm surprised if those seats were dry when they left. They loved it. So good on them.
The way it should be.
Absolutely. Right. We've done it. This is a lovely starting art conversation of art and culture. So let's carry that on with Ash. What have we been reading this week?
I'm so pleased you asked. What have we been reading this week? We have been reading a short story called August Heat by a writer whose name is, he said, stood in for time, the English author W F Harvey, first published in the collection Midnight House and Other Tales in 1910. The synopsis of it. So it starts off, we're introduced to James Clarence Withencroft, an artist. He's at home on a hot August morning when an idea for a drawing comes to him. Several hours later, he's completed a rather inspired pencil sketch. It shows a criminal in court who's just been sentenced. The man is obese, clean-shaven, with a mostly bald head, and his expression is that of utter collapse. Satisfied with the work, James rolls up the sketch, places it in his pocket, and goes out for a walk in the oppressive heat. After aimlessly walking about, James comes to a gate with a sign for a monumental mason named Atkinson. Hearing a cheerful whistle and chiseling noises, James decides to go into the yard. The mason hears his steps and turns around. James is surprised to see it is the man in his sketch, except he's smiling and appears to be very friendly. They begin to talk. So Atkinson is working on a headstone for an exhibition. He proudly shows James his beautiful work, and the inscription reads, "Sacred to the memory of James Claren Withencroft." James feels a chill seeing not only his own name, but also his birth date correctly inscribed on the headstone. The date of death is listed as today. Atkinson says the name simply came to him. James tells Atkinson his name and confirms the date of his birth. He then shows him the sketch. The two men reason out that Atkinson must have seen James's name, and James must have seen Atkinson somewhere. Atkinson invites James to supper, introduces him as a friend to his wife. After supper, the two men go back outside and continue the conversation. Fearing James may get into a fatal accident on his way home, Atkinson invites him to stay till midnight. They go upstairs to smoke, hoping it may be cooler inside. James sits writing down the extraordinary events of the day. Atkinson has sent his wife to bed and is smoking and sharpening some tools. It's after 11, and James is just biding his time. He notes that the heat is stifling, enough to drive a man mad.
That's the one I read. Yeah.
What did you think to it?
I absolutely adored it.
Yeah. Same here. I thought it was fucking brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought it's one of those kind of strange ones. I actually listened to it twice in a row because when I first listened to it, I was really enjoying it. And then I thought, did I miss a bit in the middle? Because it just ended the way it ended. I missed something there. And I went back. I had actually missed a particular point of because it's, when you're listening to things,
yeah,
sometimes you'll have a different thought.
Right.
And so it's still going on, but you're not really taking it in sometimes.
Yeah.
So I went back and listened to it, and yes, and I had missed a particular point of it. Yeah, loved it. I thought it was odd, quirky. I thought the actual way that the story flowed, the language used in it was it's one of those odd ones. It's written in 1910. Might have actually been written the story might have been written in 1906 because it was set in 1906. But it felt like someone doing a pastiche of that time rather than being of its time in a way. Yeah. It wasn't completely written in the style of something from that time, but had certain uses of language that were like there was a linking rather than linked, using the word linking rather than linked.
Yeah.
In saying I was linking it together rather than it was linked. And it was those little phrases. And I love those. You know how much I love those kind of phrases. And it was full of those. And it was great. And the whole end of it was so sinister, so wonderfully sinister. And logically, bar the fact of the sort of like he drew a picture of someone he hadn't met before and the guy had written a name of someone he hadn't met before, the actual story works in a really odd way on a logical scale. It was brilliant.
It really was. And I think that ending is one of the best endings that we've read on here because there wasn't actually an ending there. It was just, this is where they are 5 minutes before midnight when the story ends. You make up what's going to happen. And yeah.
No, but there was an ending, wasn't there? Because it was written in the first person. And it's something that I wrote a short story when I was at school about being nuclear war that has an ending like that in it. Now, because honestly say, I have never read that story before, but I'm sure I've read endings like that and I can't quite place where I got them from. Because it's in the first person, you're not going to see the death. You can only see the setup to it. And it's the person behind with a big knife, isn't it? You're seeing something that the author isn't seeing.
Yeah.
What he's describing, because he's describing it in all innocence. But because it's the whole thing is because it's a scary story. The author doesn't know it's a scary story when he's telling it because he's first person. But it's a scary story. So something bad has to happen. You know, there has to be a villain in the piece. Otherwise, it's not going to work. But the author has no idea that that has to happen. So as the reader, you're ahead of him and you're almost going, turn around. Don't sit there going on about the heat can turn someone mad. Turn around, man. You're about to get murdered. Yeah, it's brilliant.
That's a really interesting point that you're raising there. So are you saying that a first-person narrator is unaware of the genre that they are narrating?
Yeah.
So in a horror story, they're simply narrating. They're oblivious to the genre.
They should be. They have to be. If otherwise, it becomes too universally aware. Because if it's a first person, the person in the story cannot know anything else about it. The reader is following them. So the surprises that they have, it's like if you take a first person story. Let's do the classic mirror jump idea. You look in the mirror, there's nobody there. You push the door closed and there's someone behind and it makes the person jump. Now, as a viewer or as a reader, you know that mechanism. You have to know that mechanism because that's what builds the tension for the jump. You know it's going to happen. But the person shutting the glass mirror, the mirror itself, the mirror door, can't know that's going to happen. Otherwise, they would have the tension when they're shutting the door. They have to do it completely free and unshackled by the genre itself. So the actual main character has to be free of the conventions of the genre for the mechanisms of the genre to scare them as it happens within the story.
But if we look at, say, something by Edgar Allan Poe, you've got a first-person narrator, and not one of the ones where it's an unreliable narrator, although I concede that all narrators are. But if we get one where it's one of the more reliable narrators, because they're describing something that's got the furniture and the semantic detail of a horror story, surely the narrator is aware of it. If you were writing down what you decide that you're going to write down your day as your day's been, and throughout your day you've noticed that somebody's put a skull on your desk, and you know that there is a dark shadow moving, aren't you going to be thinking this is lots of spooky overtones?
Well, yeah, but that's not the same thing that I'm talking about. You see, if you have a skull, let's take that scenario, and you have a skull that sits on the desk and a dark shadowy figure goes across. If you are completely aware of the genre mechanics to say, hang on a second, I've just stepped into a horror story, then you will then have the schema to be able to go, so that means the next thing that's going to happen is I'm going to die, so I shall leave. Which is why it seems a lot of characters make very strange decisions within horror stories. Not because the character is actually making a strange decision based on the facts of the case. If they were sat there, they seem like strange decisions because as a reader, you're kind of looking through their eyes, but you have more information than they do. Because the amount of times, how many times have you ever done something where, the classic case, not scary, is, I'll just touch up a little bit of paint so I won't change my very good clothes and end up getting paint on your very good clothes. Yeah. So that's a strange decision. That's a decision that if that was in a first person story, then the reader would go, just change your clothes before you do it. You know that they're going to get it on their clothes because it's so obvious it's going to happen. But you can't be aware of that in the moment. So it's a very interesting thing, actually, because I'm trying to think if Edgar Allan Poe over exit. I don't think he does. I think that's why he has that skill. And I think that's why, remember that Anger Street or whatever it was, that a lot of people sort of like hold up as this great example of a ghost story. I think one of the problems with that is I think the characters were too aware of being in a ghost story, and where Bram Stoker actually then takes it that one step further with the judge's house is the guy in the judge's house is not aware that he's in a ghost story, but you are, so you're one step ahead or two steps ahead of where he's going, but he isn't. He becomes bogged down by the curiosity of it, and that's why he ends up making bad decisions.
I think you're right in that one, and also in Bram Stoker's Dracula in the first chapters, Harker is oblivious to the spooky supernatural setting that he's in, but he does become more aware of it as it goes on, as he becomes more familiar with what Dracula's actually doing. And I don't know. I mean, I think right, once we've finished this, I'm probably going to go in the lounge and Tracy and I will sit down and we'll watch a spooky film. And if it gets really spooky, I'm going to sort of like ask her to take me up to the toilet when I need to go to the toilet because I don't know.
Exactly. Precisely. Yeah. Because you are aware. If you walked into a spooky house, you are completely aware of the horror. This is why Scream is so good, actually, in that respect, because it is self-aware and it says, you know the rules. You know the rules of a scary house. You know all the rules of the staircase. You know, it's like, you know, when I first watched The Changeling around about 1981. No, actually, and I was living in Lightbound, so it was about 83. I first watched The Changeling, and I watched it on my own around about midnight. And then I went to go to bed, and there's a lot of stuff about staircases in that. And I just looked up the stairs, and then I went and slept on the couch. Right?
Yeah.
But that staircase is different from if you were in the situation, and that's a really great story for the why haunted house stories sometimes fail is because the decision should be just run away. You know, I mean, she was only 6. She's gone to live in the TV. She'll be happy there. You know, leave. But you've got to establish the story in such a way so that they have reasons to stay in the house. And so you've got to sort of like give really big emotional ideas, like Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. She locks the doors and they're not allowed to leave because it's an experiment. That's a perfect example of how you can have people aware of it being really, really creepy, but they can't get out because the experiment is to keep them locked in the house.
But do you know, the more I'm thinking about it, the more I still want to sort of like stand by my guns and say that we do have a lot of narrators that are aware of their genre. If you look at 50 Shades of Grey, I know it's probably not one of your favourite books that you've been reading and rereading the last couple of weeks, but within that, you've got the narrator, Anesthesia, who is aware of the romantic, erotic situation she's in.
Yes.
And is narrating it in a romantic, erotic way. If you look at any Raymond Chandler novel, you know that it's a mystery and you know that it's been narrated, thank you, as though it's been narrated, one, to set out the clues, one, to capture somebody who's done something remiss. So I think there are a lot of...
In the first person.
Yes.
Raymond Chandler. Oh, yeah, no, the Raymond Chandlers are first person, aren't they? No, but I will stand by that. I will take your argument for 50 Shades of Grey as winning my argument, in that she's too aware of it, and that's one of the reasons it's rubbish in that respect, because it's too on the nose because of it.
I don't think he went on a nose.
I don't know. I can't remember that part of the contract. I think it's one of those. I think there are a number of cases when they are aware of the genre they're in. And I think sometimes that's what makes the difference between something being incredibly powerful and brilliant and something being just okay and ordinary, is the believability of the character. And I think that believability of the character can only come about by, they can be fearful. I mean, it's like, just take the Raymond Chandler novels. He does not know who's done it at the start. He has to deliver the clues. Yeah. He has to do all that. And he's a detective, so he knows the game. So that's the point, is he knows the game. So he's already in the game. So he's already got a certain amount of schemata, you know, within what he's doing. But the crime itself, he doesn't know what's going on. He knows there's the chance of somebody being behind the door, which is why he has his gun ready. It's a good choice because he's aware of his environment and he's aware of his game. But if you were going to try and jump out on him and take him by surprise, then he has to be less aware of it. So he has to almost seem naive to the events, which in this story he is. You know, he's watching a guy sharpening a chisel whose face has just changed into a weary kind of face that he's drawn in the picture, and he is unaware of what is about to happen. I would almost argue Dr. Watson in the Sherlock Holmes is classic for that, in that you to get the best out of Holmes, you're reading between the lines of what Watson is saying, not actually what Watson is saying. And you build, that's why there are so many interpretations of the character, because you can read so many interpretations of the character, because you're not actually seeing Sherlock Holmes in most of the stories. You're seeing Watson's view of him. So therefore, he's not completely and utterly within it.
But is Watson aware of the genre that he's writing?
I think in the adaptation, when they're doing it as a blog, yes.
Right.
Because he's writing it in that genre. And actually, you could argue that he might be, and that actually the mysteries that are being solved are not actually being solved in as an exciting and logical and fantastically intelligent way, because it is the unreliable narrator going on. Watson is obviously very much in admiration, even possibly love, of Sherlock. You know,
who can blame him? He looks like Benedict Cumberbatch. Yeah.
Well, even Jeremy Brett, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah.
You know, so you've got all that kind of thing. I think it's one of those things of, I wonder if you went and looked at them, if you could identify whether, and it needs to be the first person. I think it's in first person storytelling, and to really get the character to be authentic, they have to not be aware of the genre they're in.
I'm still staying fixed to the fact that characters need to be aware of the genre, just to go with Poe's unity of impression, just to give the whole cohesiveness. Because if they're not sort of like telling us that story in a cohesive fashion that ticks the boxes that we want in the genre, in that case, we're not getting the story that we want.
But see, this is this is where it becomes almost existential, isn't it? Is separating the narrator from the writer. So the writer is writing stuff in that the character doesn't see. So in this case, let's look at this story, because it's a beautifully short story. The end of this story is an absolute classic case of it, in that it all seems very naive to a certain degree. You know, he's drawn a picture, he's walked past the shop and felt drawn into the shop, and he's walked in, and there is the person he has drawn. Right? If you are aware of horror stories and spooky stories, and you are aware of that, you leave at that moment in time, because you know there is no good ending to this. You may make an inquiry, but as soon as he shows you a gravestone with a death day on it, and they even, actually, the guy who's doing the killings, he's aware to a certain degree, because he actually says, why go home now when it's an hour away and take the chance of being caught in an accident? By leaving now, you're taking the chance of dying. If you stay here, that means, you know, you're not going to get run over by a horse and cart, you know, the consummate death of an Edwardian gentleman, right? So that's not going to happen to you. So he's aware of that. But instantly, if you are aware of the genre, you know that that man's going to kill you. The guy who's done, because he's in the dock, he's got a gravestone, he's sharpening tools, and our narrator is unaware of the oddity of those particular parts. And he has to be, otherwise he would just leave. So therefore, his actions they seem naive, but they don't seem daft from a logical point of view.
But he's sort of like following the logical point of view of, he's aware that something's likely to happen, that the gravestone has been written, and that the gravestone is likely to be something that's a portent of the doom that he's going to suffer. So staying with the gravestone maker, there's a word for it, chiseler.
Chiseler will do.
Yeah, staying with Mr. Atkinson seems like the safest and most logical thing to do, because it eschews the danger of meeting Jack the Ripper
but not if you are aware of the genre you are in. If you are aware that you're in a horror story, and this is where the reader would be shouting at the page, and this is why it becomes exciting to the reader, is the reader is one step ahead and goes, no, staying there is probably the worst idea you can do, because it's there. All the elements are in this shop. You have been drawn to this shop. You drew this man. This man's got your name. Everything is there in the shop. So if you're aware of it as a genre within that, you would be going, it's the worst decision to make. But you're right, within the universe of not being aware of it being that kind of genre, it is the safest place to be. It makes perfect sense. Stay here till midnight because this man seems perfectly reasonable. He's given me mackerel. He's read me the Bible. Everything seems perfectly fine.
Please let him kill me now. Yeah. But no, my thinking is that it's very much like Final Destination movies in the fact that we know that a murder is going to be committed. We know a death is going to happen.
Yes.
And we know that death is likely to be James. And no matter what option James picks, he's going to end up dead.
Yeah.
The whole fact that he's drawn Mr. Atkinson looking miserable and in the dock could almost be coincidental. I mean, it wouldn't be because it's part of the story. But if he just sort of like said, "No, don't fancy staying with you here because you don't like the picture of this bloke in the dock, and maybe I'm going to put 2 and 2 together and make 4, as in you were the person that murdered me. So I'm going to go home." He would have been run over. There would have been a lightning flash. There would have been a lorry.
I'm not saying his life would have been saved. I was just thinking, actually, as you were saying that. There was a thing that you just said there where you said, obviously it's not a coincidence because it's part of the story.
Yeah.
Right. But to the character telling the story, it is a coincidence to start with. To the reader, it's not a coincidence because it's part of the story. It's like those pitch meetings.
Yeah.
So you're telling me when you shoot that guy, he dies first time, but when you shoot this guy 3 times, he survives. Why? He's one of the main characters. Yeah. Being one of the main characters is always great. It's that he can't die because he's part of the main character, or this guy has to die because he is part of the main story. But he can't be aware of that. Because he has to, in Final Destination, which is it's interesting that you bring that up because I consider Final Destination to be a real genre buster in the way done thing. You do have characters that are aware they're going to die and they become frantic at every little thing that's happening. And that's where the tension comes up. They become aware of the rules that they are now part of. And that's where, as you're watching it, you align with them. And actually, you don't really align with them. You're not telling them to get out of the way. You're dead excited for the way they're going to meet their end because that's where the ride is. So it comes along those lines. So they become aware of their own rules within the thing. And that's where part of the joy comes. But I don't think that's the rule. I think that's the exception.
But with the Final Destination ones, there are some that become more and more aware as the narrative goes on. But if you think to Final Destination 2, you've got the guy who's just won the lottery and he's avoided death. He's living in a shitty apartment place and carrying a load of different boxes. And as he's walking up the stairs, he nearly treads on a roller skate and he nearly treads. But he's completely unaware of these rules.
He is,
sort of like goes in, he puts his hand down into the waste disposal and gets his hand stuck. And when he's got his hand stuck, the pan bursts into flames, and you just realise something's about to happen. But he still seems to think that he's going to get out of there all right.
Yeah. So again, he's outside of the knowledge that we have.
Yes.
As viewers. Now in film, it's dead easy because you've got like I say, you look. I made a short film called "I Like It," and we have Matt. Matt. You've met Matt.
That's brilliant. Yes.
And the end scene is me looking at something that the audience can't see, and then him stood behind me with a wrench, with this look on his face, and then it cuts to him just dropping an empty pair of shoes into a box. So you never see the death,
right?
But the audience sees what's going on behind my character, and my character's completely unaware of what this character's intentions are at that particular moment in time. And that gives the audience that I know something you don't know. And that creates that kind of tension. And actually what you were saying there in Final Destination 2, I remember that scene. And it's hilarious because you as the audience are completely aware of what this film is about.
Yeah.
And you're waiting for that moment. So every single thing that happens is the moment you are waiting for. He is unaware of the rules of that movie at that particular moment in time. And all these things that are happening are not quite what he's expecting to see in that respect. So again, I'll hold on to that. I think there's a certain amount that the writer has to be fully aware of everything that's going on, obviously. But I think it's a really telling point. First person. I never thought of it this way before, actually. That a first person story really nails down the ability to get information across that the writer knows without actually writing it. Because as a reader, you are being pulled along and you are knowing stuff that the character that you're reading about doesn't. I mean, let's take War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells, probably one of the greatest first person stories written in that respect. And particularly now when you're looking back as a retro sort of thing, not necessarily when it was on, but you knew it's called War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
Right? The book is called War of the Worlds. You're opening that book knowing there is going to be death and destruction.
Yeah.
The chances of anything coming from Mars are 1,000,000 to 1, right? You already there. You've gone, of course, these are Martians coming. You're not going to believe Ogilvy as a reader. You're not going to take Ogilvy's advice as a reader because it's called War of the Worlds. And as you say, this thing coming from Mars is part of the story. It cannot be anything other than a Martian invasion. War of the Worlds, this is what's happening. Yet Ogilvy gives the advice that it can't be from Mars, and everyone, including the narrator, believes him. So you are already at odds with the account that you're reading. So you're not really looking at it through their eyes. You're reading their account and you're almost making judgments on that character because the character is not making the kind of calls that you would be making, only because you have advanced information that character doesn't have, written within the subtext of the way the writer writes.
Yeah, a fascinating area of discussion.
That's amazing. Yeah. I think I need to lie down.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting thought exercise,
isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm right either. I'm just thinking.
I don't think either of us are right.
No, and that's the point, isn't it? It's a nice thing to suddenly go looking for. It's a really good thing to look out for, I think. See, how much is that character genuinely aware of what's going on around them?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for picking this story because I'd never have had that thought without this one.
Isn't it a brilliant story?
Yeah.
I was just so impressed. When I think I've listened to it about 3 or 4 times this week. Just each time I've thought, God, that ending.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is. It's that innocence. It's like, oh, yeah. No, say what you were saying. Go and say. Sorry, I do apologize. I feel like I jumped in then.
I'd finished.
Oh, it's like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when the whale and the geranium suddenly come into existence. And the conversation of the whale on its way down. And it's creating all the different words for all its different bits. And then it looks down at this big round, we'll call it ground. I wonder if it'll be friends. The innocence in what the whale says and the outcome of such a horrific end are completely juxtaposed in the way it goes. And that's what happens at the end of this. I think that's why this ending is so great, because the guy writing about what the other guy is doing is so innocent and naive to what the reader knows is about to happen. And so when it stops, you don't need to continue. You don't need the descriptions. You don't need to write your own stories afterwards. You just know 100% that sharpened chisel was not being used on marble. And it's the heat. He's been driven mad by the heat. And all the clues are there all the way through that this guy is so fat and so working hard and so oppressed by the heat that he goes mad. And you know all of that in that last little line. You know, it's...
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Excellent storytelling. Glad we both like that one.
Yeah, brilliant. Absolutely. If you don't ever read that story, there's something wrong with you, because it's just brilliant.
And it's less than 15 minutes, and it's just perfect.
Well worth it.
So, question time.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
What we're reading this week?
Oh, well, I thought I was looking through and doing some research, and I came across this sort of thing. I thought, oh, you know what? I have never, ever read it. And so I'm going to buy the book. I do apologize because there isn't actually an audio version of this that I found. If we do find one, we will put it up. But I want to read The Last Seance by Agatha Christie.
All right. I'm not familiar with that one.
She wrote a book of ghost stories called The Last Seance, and they're all short stories, and they're all of supernatural thing. She's known as being the master, the goddess of the murder mystery, and rightly so. She is an absolute genius and one of the best writers, and the most successful and the biggest selling writer even to this day. Not even J.K. Rowling can touch her numbers. But I got to say, I was unaware of her spooky tales, and I just happened upon it, and I thought, we have to read that. So there is a BBC adaptation on YouTube,
right,
of it. It's a contemporary adaptation of The Last Seance. I haven't found the audio reading of the actual text. It doesn't look like it's that long in the actual book itself, which I'm going to purchase, so I'm going to definitely read it. It's about 16 pages in novel size. So, what, about 2,000 words?
So, The Last Seance is the title of the short story.
Yeah, it's the first short story of the collection.
Right, I'm going to look out and see what I can find, and I'm excited. Agatha Christie. Can't beat a bit of Agatha.
No, I see. And I actually sat there thinking, how are we going to get some Agatha Christie into this? I wasn't aware of much of her short story writing, but it was one of those things of we have to. You've got to read some Agatha Christie because she is just such an amazing writer. Any creative writing discussion has to include Agatha Christie. So to find that she wrote some spooky stories, I was like, yeah, that has to happen.
Brilliant. Right. I'm going to get a copy of that and look forward to reading it.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Well, as always, Ash, thank you so much. That was a wonderful conversation.
Really enjoyed that. Enjoyed it a hell of a lot. Yes.
Brilliant. Well, that just leaves me to say, right. Bye then.
TTFN. Bye.